Welcome to this special episode of the Money Marketing Podcast, brought to you in association with Royal London. In this series, we're exploring key topics shaping the future of financial advice, from client conversations to regulatory shifts and beyond. Stay tuned as we speak to expert voices from across the industry, sharing insights, ideas, and real-world experience. Hello and welcome to this special series of Money Marketing Podcast. I'm Kimberley Dondo and I'm joined today by Ricky McKinney, UK Risk and Compliance Director at Royal London. Could you give us a bit of background into yourself and what you do at Royal London?
Yeah, definitely. So thanks for having me along, first of all. I'm a risk person. So Royal London, I've been here Royal London for 12 years. In a CF10, SMF16 role. So for your listeners, that's a compliance person, really. And Royal London is, without going back over the advertising, we are the UK's largest mutual pension protection and investment provider. So my job sits across those product domains and really just helping Royal London align to, our strategy and regulation more generally. There's a bit of compliance in there, but increasingly, certainly now, a lot of my role is looking at how we can help progress our strategic objective around helping advisors grow, helping address the advice gap that's emerged. So my job's become more interesting and more fun because it's probably closer to the front end of things. But yeah, there's a healthy amount of still in an ivory tower telling other people how to do things.
So with that, in today's episode, we're going to be covering a lot. So we're going to look at outcomes-based regulation, consumer duty, the FCA's policy sprint, and the meaning of value. So starting with that regulatory shift. So what do you mean by outcomes-based regulation, and how does it differ from what came before that?
Good question, because we hear these terms bandied around a lot. So my take on things is that outcomes-based regulation is an evolution of the regulatory system that we've got in the UK, and that encompasses policy and also how the policy is supervised. So traditionally, going way back, you could say we had a kind of rules-based regulatory approach. So for any listeners that are old enough, you had a lot of adherence to specific requirements. And that evolved itself into principles. So if anyone looks at the FCA handbook, we have these 11 principles for business. Now we have 12 principles. And the FCA's and the FSA's intention was admirable. It was to allow different business models to apply the intent of the regulation in a way that suited them. And a good example of that is when, you think about the TCF initiative back in the day, treating customers fairly, Principle 6, and then it was supported with a whole, host of support and guidance, and it worked okay. But I think there's a recognition that actually, and this is coming from the FCA as well, that the next evolution in the system is a subset of principles. So you still operate out of principles, but the idea is to get closer to what's actually happening with the consumer. In the FCA's language, Royal London would say customer, advisors would say client, but we all know who we're talking about. So this idea is that, you cut through a lot of the rules that are very detailed about how firms should set themselves up and apply processes. You cut through that and you get closer to what's actually happening in practice. And we're seeing it. I think what we're seeing is, with the advent of consumer duty in 2022, it's given life to what we mean by outcomes-based regulation, and just looking at consumer duty and its structure, you've got an overarching principle to act, deliver good customer outcomes, and then you've got 3 cross-cutting rules, and then you've got 4 outcomes, and so the way that advisors will be measured and assessed by the regulator will be increasingly around, the outcomes that customers receive. And I think that's great. Personally, I think Royal London thinks it's great because it applies to us as well, because it retains that intent around innovation and flexibility, but it does have that fundamental, safeguard around consumer protection.
Right.
So yeah, evolution, maybe not revolution. Proof of the pudding is how it actually is supervised, and I guess we're in the middle of that, starting to unroll just now.
Okay. And why is this such a significant moment for the financial advice sector?
Well, there's a lot going on, right? There's a lot going on. You just have to look outside the window. I think at the policy level, there's obviously a lot of government focus on growth, and we saw that come through with the FCA, getting a secondary objective around growth. So it's always had objectives around market integrity, consumer protection, and competition and support of customers. But now we've got this growth element, and it's coming through in the FCA strategy that launched recently. It was 4 pillars, and one of them was around supporting growth in the UK. So the policy world has shifted a little bit. And I think then you've also got the regulatory system for the UK now that Brexit's done, right? That's what we think is finally over the line. And if you think about what happened before, for about 15 years, the UK's had rules come out of Europe or directives that didn't have too much say in how they were implemented. I'm thinking of things like the Mortgage Credit Directive and Insurance Distribution Directive, and everyone knows about MiFID and other things like AIFMD. So all these rules came in from Europe, and they're the result of 27 countries getting together and duking it out around what's important. And I think now what's happening in the FCA is, right, okay, if we got a financial services sector with a regulatory system that fits what goes on in the UK. And there was a really interesting speech by Nikhil Rathi in March. I would encourage everyone to read this speech, where he talked about a challenge to be more holistic. And the way he talked about it was in terms of how people live their lives. And that's one of the FCA's pillars in its strategy, is helping consumers navigate their financial lives. So you're starting to get this awareness that actually there's an opportunity here to do things differently, to get rid of some silos. But yeah, there's also some structural issues, like there's an advice gap. And again, Nikhil Rathi being really thoughtful in front of the Treasury Committee and through some other publications, saying, look, you need to have a more grown-up discussion about risk. What does risk really mean? If you're trying to meet a real substantive goal in life, and particularly as the state withdraws from a lot of financial elements in people's lives, you need to have we need to really decide what's an appropriate level of risk, because there's things like crypto on the pitch, and they're very different from an ISA. So we need to reflect, where the rules live. And I think that's really, I think that is really thoughtful and really encouraging. So that's all happening right now. And there's this demography of people who we think need help. So there's a big thing about demand versus need. But the thing you can't argue about is, there's probably not enough advisors to really cover the whole of the UK in the way that we think it should be. So I think the opportunity for outcomes-based regulation is that it sets the foundations for maybe an advice sector that can kick on. And I think, we always say you get the regulation that you deserve, and I never knew what that meant, but I do think we're starting to get the point now where I could see, if you squint, you can see with the regulation that you get regulation that's commensurate with a true profession.
Okay.
So maybe it's RDR 2.0. You could end up, I think, with outcomes-based regulation with an approach where you're treated like a profession, and that you're just asked to show the outcomes.
Okay.
What's the proof of the pudding? And I think that's really encouraging. So that's all happening right now, and it's live theatre, because you can see that the FCA is starting to say, well, the promise of outcomes-based regulation is that instead of coming up with new rules every time there's a slight change in the economic weather, if we stick to this idea of outcomes, we don't have to create new rules all the time. And as someone that worked in compliance, I've spent a lot of time getting paid for helping understand the journey between a call for input to a discussion paper, to a consultation paper, to a policy statement, to a handbook notice. And that's a long process. And it can really lead to a lot of fatigue, amongst people that are having to implement these rules. So the idea of not having as many rules in the first place and not having to change them as often is hugely encouraging. And we can see that with some of the consultations that are going on from the FCA. And we can see it in things like the advice guidance boundary review, which is a real intent to try and, use consumer duty, in my view, to create something that's quite new. So yeah, it's really exciting if you're a compliance dork, I guess. But it should be really exciting for everyone who's interested in financial services.
And how is the consumer duty shaping expectations around value and client outcomes?
Yeah, well, my own view is compliance is a contact sport. So the way that expectations are shaped is when you get that information request from the FCA, or you read a thematic review where supervising FCA teams have come and looked at different sectors and different practices. So the policy lever we've talked about a wee bit. I think setting out really clearly that there is this idea that you can start to think about a good outcome in the way of what's your target market, who you're really looking to provide a service to. The other part of it is, how are you helping people? So are you giving them support to progress financial objectives, and how are you explaining everything that you do? How clear, is your kind of language and your communications? But fundamentally, it's price and value, it's price and benefit, and it's are you providing something that is valuable? So that's all set in the rules as the policy side, but the supervision bit is really interesting, because that's coming through in things like the ongoing advice review, where superficially there's a really good result, and I commend everyone that is doing a good job. But when you look the layer below, you can see that the AFC is sending a message around, if you're providing an ongoing service, you need to be really clear what the service is. So that talks to that outcome around clarity and communication. But the other part of it is you have to deliver the service, and you have to deliver it in a way that's meaningful. And by that I mean, if you're doing a suitability review, it's a proper suitability review. So you can start to see it coming through in the way that the FCA is supervising the sector, and also going back a wee bit to retirement income thematic review. Although the FCA did the review prior to the duty really biting, it didn't lose the thread. And in the report, in the retirement income advice assessment tool that the FCA published, there's an element there on consumer duty. And again, it splits it into these outcomes. So you can start to see that, if you're running an advice business, the way that you think about consumer duty, is getting influenced by what you're seeing in terms of the FCA supervision. And it is, to my mind, very much around those four outcomes. And in terms of value, it's around being really clear on how you articulate value. And that's kind of where our research went, which is getting under the bonnet of what is value, because it gets bandied about so much, right? It's just, and you hear these phrases like it's in the eye of the beholder and everything. But the FCA challenge is, like, you need to articulate it and measure it.
Okay.
And that's not easy.
Yeah. I've always wondered that, because what is value? What I value is probably different from what you value or what my neighbor values. I think it even, like, different age demographics, like so many things come into consideration. But as you mentioned, you have done research on the meaning of value. So can you share the key findings from this research?
I'll try. There's a lot of
a lot to dive into.
So I just, while I'm doing an overview, I'd encourage everyone to get hold of the document and just sit down with a cup of strong coffee and have a read. Just to set the scene, this is the second wave of the research. So research in 2023, research in 2024. So it's still early days, but the idea is, we keep this going, these waves of research going, and you get a couple of things out of that. One of them is you're able to just at a glance see how things are going. You get a litmus test around how clients perceive value and how if they think they're getting it year on year. And I think what that does is it allows advisors who are in this business of providing value to get a sense of where they are in that journey. But the second part of it is it gives us a jumping off point to get under the skin of anything that's emerging that you could call a dimension of value, but it could be something like how people feel about fees, how they feel about investments. So it's the second wave. It's 170 advisors. I mean, we leaned heavily on Lancat's expertise, so the guys there, and a company called Opinium. So it was 170 advisors from Lancat panel. So thank you to those guys. And I think it was 2,000 consumers, and the demography was spread, and the advisor population, I think, was representative of the shape of the market. So we think it's representative. And we got into, a couple of bits, but I guess the key finding is it's not going to be a surprise, but clients say they're getting value, right? And increasingly so. So in 2024, I think on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you rate, your advisor and the value they provide you? And 66% scored more than 7 in 2024. And that was 54% that scored above 7 in 2023. So the high level trend over, that year was, increase in appreciation of value. So that's encouraging. But it's an interesting one. I think Mike Barrett at Lancat, was helping us with this. And I think his Mike's paradox, as he would probably call it and trademark it, is, people that pay for advice value it more than those who haven't received it and don't pay for it.
Right.
And everyone has bandied this about, but it's real. Like it is real. Like, until you get it, and increasingly the research showed that the longer you're in the relationship, the more you appreciate the value. And I think that makes sense if you think about, there's things that happen in your life that don't happen very often, and they don't all happen at the same time. So you have to be in a relationship, with anyone, before you really get under the skin of what's good and maybe not so good. So I think there's something around the longer you're in a relationship with an advisor, the more you appreciate the dimensions of value. And I thought that was an interesting one, actually, because it talks to this thing about ongoing advice. Like it's really valuable. So that was probably the headline metric. There was a couple of areas that were quite interesting, you might want to get into, but I think there was a lot of alignment. But one of the things we thought about was, is there any daylight between what advisors think value is and what their clients think value is? So maybe that's one of the key things that were brought to the research. Canon is getting into that gap, because that's quite an interesting area.
And what is the difference in how they perceive value? What do advisors think it is, and what do the clients think it is?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of key areas. I mean, just to reiterate, there's a lot of alignment, right? So, I think everyone's kind of agreed that, skills and knowledge are important, saving money is important, helping make decisions are important, having clear fee structure is important. Everyone's aligned on that. But what we found was quite interesting is coming through the research, advisors, only about 24% of them were saying, the most important thing is the investment return.
Okay.
But when you talk to clients, 45% would say it's the most important thing.
Mm.
And and you have to do a lot more work to get under the skin of that. But our kind of research and the discussions we were having, I think it flushed out that there's an education job to be done. And I think my own take on it, I don't think this is maybe Royal London policy yet, but there's a lot of marketing material comes out of the investment world.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to get hold of a lot of investment concepts. But one you can get hold of is a performance metric.
Mm-hmm.
It's easy to get hold of. And I think maybe that's why customers or clients hang on to it, because it's available. So maybe there's a job to be done there. And then the second domain I think is really interesting. It was around gender, and just asking men and women, what do you think is important, to see if there's any difference there. And it did come through, and I think it's come through in other, research exercises over the years, that, more men than women think that investment performance is the main thing. 50% of the male respondents and 38% of female. So for us, I think there's a thing there, even around, if you're providing advice, are you providing advice to the household? And you will be, but are you engaging with the household? And when you're presenting your annual reports, or you're even writing suitability letters or reports, who are you writing them for? And so I think there's something there around, when you get into the research around attitude to risk profiling and behavioural personalities and financial risk personalities, there are differences.
Mm-hmm.
And even at a really commercial level, if you work for an insurer, right, so hang out with a lot of actuaries, there's transfers of wealth from men to women. And we can see that coming through in the data. So even if you're wanting to make sure that you are still the household advisor, it tells me that you should really be focusing on how you're communicating and articulating and looking after the perception of value for the female half of that household, if it's a mixed gender household. So,
yeah.
I don't know if you think that's interesting. I thought it was interesting. I'm pushing to do a bit more in this area,
No, yeah. I think we've always been talking about how some advisors might be missing the mark if they aren't in contact with the spouse or the partner, because, like you said, I think the stat is 60% of women now this year now hold the wealth in the UK. So that's a massive number that you might be missing out on.
Yeah, there's a stat that I've never went and properly validated, and I think it came out of the States and the Wall Street Journal, but it was about the percentage of advisors that get sacked.
Okay.
When the husband dies, I think it was married couples, and it's a really high percentage.
Yeah.
And I thought that's really interesting, because it's probably inadvertent.
Yeah.
So it's a more unconscious bias, maybe. But yeah. So yeah, there's something in that, I think.
Yeah, maybe because they just never built the rapport, so the person just goes, "I'll go find someone else myself." But the white paper also outlines 8 steps to further future-proof your ongoing service model. So where do you think firms should start?
Yeah, well, I think I would always start with really just taking care of the absolute necessities. So if you go back to the FCA's output from the review of ongoing services, there was a call to action. There was a requirement to read the output, and we would say resolve any liability from previous arrangements. So it's boring, but sit down and fix your filing cabinet. Hopefully not a physical filing cabinet, but have a look at what you've provided, over the last, the FCA talks about 7 years because that's when the MiFID rules come in.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea is you need to be able to decide if you can evidence that you've delivered all the services set out in your agreements as required by the contract and also the FCA rules. So do that work. That's what I would say is the first step. If you've got that out of the way, you can free your mind to think about, right, what's really going on here? Where's the regulation going? And how can I take advantage of it? And the premise of this this bit of work flowed from the meaning of value research, and we just wanted to start turning, what can be dry, data and insight into, right, what can you do? So it's a terrible title. Future-proof. As soon as you hear that, I just couldn't think of a better way of saying it. But the idea is to get on the front foot and look to the future, and that's the overriding sentiment. Is there's opportunity here in the regulation, and here's a few things you could be thinking about to get on with. So that was the first one, and then you're into the concept of value and unpacking value, but doing it through the lens of the ongoing review, because we think that's probably where the rubber's hitting the road right now.
And what's your take on the growing importance of control frameworks and documented value methodologies?
I think this is going to be the biggest way that firms can navigate the developing regulatory approach. So, it's kind of, it's more of a high-level statement than anything. But if you look at the retirement income work the FCA did, the first thing they did was send out an information request. And then the FCA, looked at centralised retirement propositions.
Right.
So it's data-led. And data-led is the way the FCA is going to go. Some, advisors will have experienced the information requests that are coming out in the form of Section 165 letters. So, everyone in the sector gets this letter and it says, we need you to tell us about your firm. So data-led is fundamentally important. And you can't get that unless you've got what we would call a control framework, which in old money would be systems and controls, but it's essentially your governance machine. And data is at the heart of it. So you need to be able to tell the story of your firm, because in the new world, the way the FCA is going to work is it's going to ask for all this data, and it's got a really developing internal capability of analysing that data, and that will be how it prioritises where it goes next. So being able to respond effectively and quickly, if nothing else, it lets you get back to the day job of seeing the clients. So control frameworks are really important because they transmit really early that you are set up in a way that is completely aligned with consumer duty. And I think that is easy for someone like me to say, but I'm not sitting with systems that don't talk to each other. Right. And I've not inherited clients that don't really fit in a clear segment, as unless you do more work. So there's a tax to be paid in which you need to set yourself up, and the advice firm needs to set itself up in a way that it can get to the stage where it can, say, we've got a really effective control framework. But then it gets easier. That's the premise. The premise is that once you've got that, you've effectively aligned the regulation with how you run the business, because you're really clear around your segment. You're really clear around the value proposition. You've got monitoring in place to assess how that's going, and you can make adjustments based on the feedback. That's essentially the same cycle as a consumer duty. And we know this because we've been subject to thematic reviews as well on the provider side. And it's kind of the cycle you want to run your business on anyway as a professional services firm. You really need to be really clear on the value proposition, your cost to serve, and the extent you've got cross subsidies and things like that. So, everyone says this, but I do think this regulation is aligned with how you really want to run your professional services firm. But the step you've got to take is to look at your CRP, look at your governance, and answer that question around having an effective control framework. And you'd probably expect a compliance person to say that, right? But
Probably.
Yeah.
But I also mentioned earlier about the FCA's policy sprint. So I wanted to know what Royal London's involvement in that is.
Okay. It's been really good. It's been really, I mean, as someone who's, just stepping outside the world of compliance for a little bit, to be involved in something that's new and collaborative is just great. And I really applaud the FCA's approach to how it's gone about that point earlier about, the advice gap and how this concept of targeted support can help, to start with a few views, but to really encourage participation from the sector. Mm-hmm. I think it's fantastic. And to do it in a way that's, to lead to the development of the principles and the rules and the policy generally, it's very brave. Mm-hmm. Because, as we were talking about, everyone's got an opinion and it's quite a noisy sector. So you're signing up to get a lot of feedback that may not actually be that joined up. So it's been great. The way it's manifested itself with us is my colleague Ben Hampton, who leads for Royal London in this area. He managed to get us in front of the FCA and articulate what we really wanted to bring to the party. And there's two streams. So the targeted support, listeners will know, there's a discussion paper around decumulation and pensions and how it could really be used to help people. And I think that's really important because, retirement is this complex adaptive environment and you need a lot of help. Everyone needs help. Mm-hmm. And your existing pension provider is well placed to help with that, I think. And then there's this other stream, which is more to that growth agenda, I would say, which is accumulation and how do we help people get value from their savings in the form of, moving it to appropriate investments that over time don't get degraded by inflation. And the FCA's got a metric, I think, in the strategy about just getting people to think more and move from cash where appropriate. So two very different use cases. And the policy sprint we took part in was on the accumulation side, and it was alongside, I think it was 12 firms all in all. Mm-hmm. And Vanguard and Fidelity with it, they got the big, investment side, and then banks like HSBC and Lloyds were there, Barclays. We were there in the guise of our Wealth Wizards business, which is a digital guidance business. And there were a couple of firms like that. And there was also, SGP were there and bringing that kind of consideration of how does it play into the advice market. And firms were challenged to, come up with customer journeys around a use case, but in the concept of how would the rules work? How would the consumer protections work? And it was done in a really good spirit. Mm-hmm. And there's been a lot of bilaterals and round tables and things like that as well. So we found it hugely encouraging. And, we're really excited, and we wait and see this consultation coming out shortly on the first iteration of what the rules could look like. And mm-hmm. we're waiting on that. But the thing I would say is, our position is targeted support has got a huge role to play, but one of the huge roles it can play is to help bring down the cost of advice given by advisors. Mm-hmm. Royal London, anyone knows us, we really believe that role advisors play in getting, millions of people, better outcomes. So the key thing for us is how can we as a provider play a role using targeted support in a way that helps the advisors look after more clients. Going mm-hmm. back to that thing about outcome-based regulation, one of the worries I've got is that because there's a lot of noise and it is things like control frameworks and all that, if you think actually it's going to cost me more money or it's going to cost me more effort to look after all these clients, I'll maybe try and focus on the more wealthier segment. And we recognize you can go where you want in your business, but we really want advisors to service more clients. So we want to try to push against that potential trend that advice is going upstream. And we think targeted support could help in that regard. But we'll wait and see, right?
Yeah.
We'll wait
and see. Finally, how can firms shift from seeing regulation as a burden to seeing it as a strategic advantage? And how can Royal London support that in the next couple of months ahead?
Good question. I'd probably go back to the points I was making about alignment. So there's a bit of a glib thing that compliance people say, which is, if you just follow the rules, it'll help your business. And I'm not sure that's always been the case in terms of, shorter time frames. Because you have to put a lot of work in to align with, regulation. But I do think that outcomes-based regulation is the regulation you would want if you were running a really good professional services firm. Theoretically, there's less rules. We've got consultations on removing some requirements around changing requirements around disclosure. There was an announcement the other day about some of the extra bits of the handbook around protection being disapplied, and the FCA are quite open about what parts of the handbook do you think we could take out and rely on the duty for. So you've got this huge prize of less constant regulatory adaptation, which gives you time back to run your business. And also I think it's just this, this opportunity where your compliance is done for free if you are really clear about things like your target market, if you have a value methodology. So not just tangible stuff, but looking at the intangible. Our research, highlighted that there's more work to do around assurance and peace of mind and knowledge and experience. They're things that are hard to measure, but if you can get them in, I think then that's a set of metrics to help you run a business, which is based around trust and based around referral. So the people that are insuring or funding your business or may want to pass it on to or buy or sell it to in the future, they're going to be interested in the same stuff that the FCA is interested in. It's, what is the value, the enterprise value here as expressed through the service that you're providing. And if you can't put your finger on the types of customers you've got or how much it costs you to serve them, or even give some assurance around, the value they perceive they're getting, or if you say you can't say, how often you saw them and when you saw them, that might give you a regulatory problem, but it gives you a business problem. And I would hand on heart say it's not often that you have the compliance conversation right next to the business value conversation. And I think that's what's on offer right now. But as I said, there's a bit of work to be done. And it's just having the faith that if you do the work around the control framework and, really put in place those steps, that you'll get the payoff. And I guess that's for everyone themselves to make a judgment on.
Yeah.
You were going to ask about Royal London.
Yeah, I did. I also asked what support can advisors get from Royal London in the months ahead with all this as well.
So we're a business that really tries to support advisors, and we have a number of business consultants that are always happy to get on the phone, come and see you, and talk about this stuff. So they're set up to help understand these concepts like value and centralized retirement propositions. And we'll be doing more of that, in the months ahead. We did some roadshows recently, and I think we'll come around and talk more about that, the investment side of things, how to articulate it in a way that is meaningful. But yeah, the idea is we're just always on. So we are committed to it, and if you don't know who your local business consultant is, get in touch. There's also things like, we have Business Protection Week and Pension Awareness Week, and we fully support them as well. So yeah, the idea is you've got a partner to work through some of this stuff in a way that's not a product push.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that comes across. Like, I'm probably not equipped to talk about all the details of the proposition that Royal London offer, but we generally want to help advisors do or get through that challenging period ahead to have the ability and the right, if they want to grow their business.
Mm-hmm.
So it's much more about the business consultancy side than anything, I would say.
Yeah. Well, that all sounds like a lot that is currently happening, and a lot to consume, and hopefully we'll be able to come back to it next year as well, just to give another overview. But thank you so much for speaking with me today, Ricky. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Money Marketing Podcast in association with Royal London. We hope you found it insightful. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to follow and share the podcast, and join us next time for more expert takes on the topics that matter most in financial advice. See you next time.